How Will You Measure Your Life by Clayton Christensen, James Allworth, and Karen Dillon. Finding fulfillment using lessons from some of the world's greatest businesses. Okay, so Clayton Christensen is well known in the startup world. He wrote this book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which believe talks about why the biggest companies fail to innovate. I haven't read that book, but he's kind of a super well known figure there. He works at Harvard, in Harvard Business School. Um, yeah, and this title, how will you measure your life, immediately attracted me, especially from someone who talks about business success. I'm always kind of interested in this mashup of actual success, but then sort of like enlightenment, thinking in terms of what's actually important. And so I was surprised to find this book by him. Um, so yeah, and then this really, the title just off the bat reminds me of another book by Bonnie Ware, called The Five Regrets of the Dying. And so her sort of story was, she is or was a hospice nurse. I don't know what now, but and being a hospice nurse, of course, she's meeting people right as they're about to die, and she noticed these patterns of regrets they had about their life. And so, kind of putting these ideas together, there's another kind of famous personal development book, Stephen Covey, The Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. And I believe it's the first habit, is to start with the end in mind, right? So, instead of just doing random stuff, like really figure out where you're going, um, aka set goals, right? But yeah, set goals for your life. so, um, so anyway, he actually starts the book off talking about how he went to Harvard, and they had this reunion that was their 5 year reunion, and everyone comes back and they're in these really high paying, successful careers. He said, oh, they all seem to have married spouses that are much better looking than them, and their life seems to be going great. You know, but then you go to the 10-year reunion, the 15, and so on, and certain people aren't showing up. And it's sort of like, well, I wonder what's going on with them. And you know, you learn through the grapevine that this one doesn't live, is divorced. This one, his kids don't talk to him. And he even talks about one of the really promising people in his class was a guy named Jeffrey Skilling, who was the CEO of Enron. And so, it's not. So he actually says that a lot of the people in his class, despite kind of having head starts and seeming very impressive on paper, that things were actually much, much worse for them. So here's from the book, page 6. How can I be sure that one, I will be successful and happy in my career? Two, my relationships with my spouse, my children, and my extended family and close friends become an enduring source of happiness. Three, I live a life of integrity and stay out of jail. These questions might sound simple, but they're questions that so many of my classmates never asked or had asked, but lost track of what they learned. Yeah, and so year after year, I've been stunned at how the theories of the course illuminate issues in our personal lives as they do in the companies we've studied. So the basic gist of this book, finding fulfillment using lessons from some of the world's greatest businesses, he then goes on to talk about how in Harvard Business School that basically they have these case studies, and these case studies present theories as to how businesses have made decisions and why they've made decisions. And so that these theories actually can predict what will happen, right? So if you have a theory about the way people act, it should predict how they'll act in certain circumstances. And so a lot of this book is grafting, basically every chapter in this book is grafting theories from the business world and applying them sort of to your personal life, largely to your career. Okay, so booting into this book, with that story at Harvard, and he really talks about, what actually makes us tick, right? That's the title of one of the chapters. And he talks about how a lot of motivation theory and a lot of what happens in corporations is, well, let's give someone a bonus because that'll make them work harder or that'll get the result we want. And I think that that kind of works to an extent. But he even talks about how you'll often see people who they don't act in accordance with that. And I actually remember at one company I worked with, they were trying, we were real early on, and they were trying to get us to recruit our friends and stuff to join. And they offered us a bonus, which was going to Hawaii as like a vacation. Now, first of all, I wasn't one who wasn't in a relationship, and so it was kind of weird. I'd just go to Hawaii by myself, but I remember that actually demotivating me because like now I had to pitch it to my friends, but I'd always think in the back of my mind that I wasn't really doing that because I wanted to work with them. I was doing it to get this external reward. And so it's like it changes motivation from being intrinsic to being extrinsic, right? And so he advances a theory. This is one of the many theories in this book by this guy, Henry Mintzberg, who wrote this book, The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. And basically the theory there is that actually people are looking for two things in their career. The first one is what he calls a hygiene factor, which is basically like, are you getting paid enough, right? If you're getting paid enough, then you can be happy. But if you're not getting paid enough, then you start to worry and kind of be in this very scarcity mindset. And so number one is just, are you generally respected on the job? Are you getting paid enough? And then the second part is actually your motivation or fulfillment part, right? And so that part is, is this work meaningful to me? Is this job going to give me a chance to develop? Am I going to learn new things? Will I have an opportunity for recognizing and achievement? I'm quoting him here. Am I going to be given responsibility? These are the things that will truly motivate you. Once you get this right, the more measurable aspects of your job, that's money, will fade in importance. And so I thought that was really interesting, really on point with at least my experience. And so this actually kind of explains some of the issues I've had at both extremes. So one is, I'm not really in love with the work. Maybe I'm okay at it, but I'm really just doing it for money, and that's okay. Like I'm making money and banking some money, but I don't feel fulfilled every day, right? And then the other extreme is kind of the one I'm in right now, where I'm doing stuff where I'm really growing, I'm really, experiencing new stuff, learning a ton, and, I'm really excited every day to get to work. But on the other hand, I'm not making much money, right? And so, it's like the hygiene factors aren't quite there. Okay, the next chapter is all about sort of these two kind of opposing forces, and I like to think of them as top down versus bottom up. But he calls it the balance of calculation and serendipity. And I guess this is really where this author Mintzberg was quoted. But yeah, the rise and fall of strategic planning. So there are always people who think you can plan everything out, and then there are other people who kind of shoot from the hip and learn as they go. And it's funny because I was thinking of a friend who I had growing up, and I remember, he was kind of depressed one day, and we were in our 20s, and he sort of said, I had this whole 5-year plan, and, I thought I'd be here, and I'm not there. And I just sort of laughed at that, like, 5-year plan? Who would have a 5-year plan? Like, I don't even plan more than, like, I plan for tomorrow, and that's kind of it, and it just seems so absurd because, like, things change so much in like 6 months that you can't really predict anything 5 years out. At least in your 20s. I mean, maybe when you're older you can. And so, yeah, I've thought about that. But here he basically talks about how these are two opposing forces. This sort of top-down planning where you make a goal and you reverse engineer and you work backwards, right? Like the Amazon book. Versus sort of spontaneous, emergent properties, right? Things you don't anticipate. And he actually talks about how in his own career ambition was to be the editor of the Wall Street Journal. And he basically talks about how he, couldn't get that job, and so he did something else, and then he founded a company. The company failed, and then he ended up teaching at Harvard. And he says, well, right now at age 59, I still wonder. And by the way, he's writing this book as he has cancer, and so he kind of sees the end of his life coming, and that's probably what prompted this book. But he says, now at age 59 and after a 20-year career in academia, I still wonder whether it is finally time to try to become editor of the Wall Street Journal. Academia became my deliberate strategy and will stay that way as long as I continue to enjoy what I'm doing, but I have not twisted shut the flow of emergent problems or opportunities. Just as I never imagined 30 years ago I'd end up here, who knows what might be just around the corner. Yeah, so he talks about how you need both. You need both the deliberate strategy where you plan out a goal and you set up all the milestones and do all that, and the opposite, which is you just happen to see stuff and say, oh, well, maybe I should do that thing. One thing that's become really interesting to me, and this is purely selfish, is how people make career choices. There's a book that was recommended by Epstein, the Inside the Box guy, author, not the famous guy in the news, that's called Dark Horse, that's on my reading list, which is all about how people make career choices. But I've noticed this among people in my network, how they all have these stories that are sort of like this story here. Someone that recently I've been intersecting with a lot and I really admire is Leon Hendricks, and he has a story about how he was trying to create a physical product brand. He was selling it on Amazon. And was making money at it, but he didn't like it that much, and he just ended up creating these funny videos. And he would send this on the message board where everyone was talking about the Amazon private label stuff, and everyone just loved those, right? And he loved making it too. And so he kind of found his zone of genius, but it was accidental, right? It was just like this little distraction. And I think you see this over and over again. You see this all the time in startups. And this kind of relates to, the Inside the Box book as well, where these constraints often produce, new emergent capabilities or new emergent ways of being or ways of operating that wouldn't have been seen before. And so there's a few funny stories in this book that kind of relate to that Inside the Box book. But yeah, with Leon, I mean, he ended up becoming kind of a famous YouTuber. He says he's in the top 0.1%, and I totally believe that. He gets millions of views, but it was all through an accident, right? And so there are always these stories. And so let me give you two stories from this book that really stick out. The first one, or at least one here, is about, two. So one is about Sam Walton. So Sam Walton was originally going to go to St. Louis, and he was basically creating like a department store, but his wife didn't want to raise their family in a big city, and so she was like, oh, you must be, we have to stay in a little town of 10,000 people. And so Sam Walton originally wasn't going to do some, crazy Walmart thing, which he ended up doing. It just happened to be an accident of staying in the little town. Because he stayed in the little town, he could then dominate all the small companies, right, in that little town, where if he went to St. Louis, he never would have done that. So it's just like a kind of accidental thing, emergent property there. They also give this story, and here's the second story, it's of Honda. And basically the story is when, after World War II, Japan was decimated, right? And when they were rebuilding, the big motorbikes in the U.S. were Harley. But the Honda execs realized, and this is, I guess, in the 70s or whatever, that their motorbikes could be made much cheaper than Harley, right? Because their labor costs were so much lower. And so they actually introduced their bikes into the U.S. But people in the U.S. didn't buy them because the bikes were really made for much shorter distances that people would travel in Japan. and so they'd leak a bunch of oil, and they were just sort of kind of unreliable. Um, and so it was just a happy accident that this happened. One of the execs took one of these motorbikes and went up to the hills in LA and started basically joyriding, on the hills and doing all these like dirt tricks, in the side of the mountain. And it was, I think, someone else saw him and basically said, "Oh, that looks like a lot of fun, right?" And this basically became their entry into the market. It was just like a total accident. And so then that's kind of how they ended up dominating like the dirt bike market in the US. And so it's just, yeah, it's just purely emergent. Like, no one could have predicted it. No one could have planned those things out, right? So anyway, his main idea here is that you want to experiment and iterate quickly. Um, and the strategy often doesn't come from an ivory tower. So what actually happens is you have these emergent properties. You find something that's working, and then you create the deliberate strategy, right? For those kind of incremental wins. But it's already, you kind of already know which path you're on. So that's pretty different than kind of planning everything out. There's also a book called Discovery Driven Planning. And I bought another book by the same authors, Rita Gutter McGrath and Ian McMillan, The Entrepreneurial Mindset, which talks about how a lot of companies actually don't do this. What they'll do is they'll create a sort of long-term forecast. They'll put some numbers in Excel, but they never actually tackle the assumptions that will cause the company to go bust. And so I think this is actually a little further on in the book, but this kind of touches on the Working Backwards book, which is about this, but it's how do you test those assumptions like really quickly and cheaply, right? There are going to be 20 assumptions for this project to work. How do we go and spend a day, and however many staff that's going to be, or $500 or whatever to test this thing, instead of long down the road figuring out that it's not going to work. And so there's a bunch of stories about that. I'll just read directly from the book. There's a much better way to figure out what is going to work and what isn't. It involves reordering the typical steps involved in planning a new project. When a promising new idea emerges, financial projections should of course be made, but instead of pretending these are accurate, acknowledge that at this point they are really rough. Instead, ask the project team to compile a list of all the assumptions that have been made in those initial projections. Then ask them, which of these assumptions needs to prove true in order for us to realistically expect that these numbers will materialize? These assumptions on this list should be rank ordered by importance and uncertainty. At the top of the list should be the assumptions that are most important and least certain, while the bottom of the list should be those that are least important and most certain. Instead, find ways to quickly and with as little expense as possible test the validity of the most important assumptions. So, yeah, he basically talks about all of this in relation to, he's taking these, this principle that these two authors, McGrath and Macmillan, have come up with in terms of entrepreneurial situations, and he's actually talking about jobs, right? And so, I was thinking a lot about this, that one of the greatest things I think this is a really simple thing, but it's the whole bring your daughter to work or bring your child to work. Because it's like no one really knows what anyone else is doing unless they can just shadow them or watch them. And so as a kid, I was brought in to my mom's work. I saw what she was doing. She worked on a trading floor, and then my dad was also in Wall Street, and he worked as an investment banker. And so I could start to see what a typical day was like my mom was answering the phone, she was typing some stuff on a typewriter, she was confirming trades with the other people in the office. My dad was largely in Excel. He was talking to his coworkers would pop their head over the cubicle, and they would curse like sailors, and they didn't really seem to care that that a little kid was there. You know, it's like you start to understand all these tangible things about what people are actually doing at work. And, you know, every once in a while you hear a story of like, you know, some kid who go, or some guy who goes and he, you know, does the whole undergrad thing, he does the pre-med thing, you know, he goes to medical school, and, you know, it's like 10 years down the line, and then it's like his first day of being a doctor. He realizes he totally hates it. And so it's like he could have just spent like a day shadowing a doctor. And I actually wonder if real education, like what you should be doing when you're 17, is like not worrying about which college you'll get into, but spending like one day going and shadowing like every you know, possible profession you think you might want. You know, what are the upsides and downsides of those, right? So yeah, so anyway, it's just, you know, on this chapter, it's like this whole thing about serendipity and how do you test stuff. I just thought was super useful. Let me just read a few of these. This is like the end of the chapter. What we can learn from how companies develop strategy is that although it is hard to get it right at first, success doesn't rely on this. Instead, it hinges on continuing to experiment until you do find an approach that works. Only a lucky few companies start off with a strategy that ultimately leads to success. Yeah, and so just a little commentary on that. The entrepreneurial mindset talks about this, but there are a bunch of other books that talk about this and kind of famous examples. So like Slack is one of the most famous examples, I think, in recent times of this, where they started as a gaming company. The game like totally failed. The founder, who is the founder of Flickr, Stuart Butterfield, said, you know, I'll investors, hey, look, you know, here's all your money back, but by the way, we're starting another thing, so if you want to invest in that, you know, and it was a tool that they were using internally at this video game company, and so that's what Slack ended up being. And so, you know, just also kind of in line with inside the box, it's like when you are resource constrained, you know, it's almost like you need to be resource constrained and fail before you get to the good stuff. There's another book by an exec called John Mullins, and I want to read his book, but it's called Getting to Plan B. And, you know, that's the whole idea. It's like, well, you're just assume you know, Plan A is going to fail, and like you want to speed up that failure, you know, and do that as quick as possible, and spend as little money as possible to get to that failure, so that then you can get to the real, what you should have known from the start, but there's no way you could have. And so it's that sort of emergent property again. There's a story or a saying in startups that Bill Gurley has, who also has a book out that I want to read. That's called that says most startups die from indigestion, not starvation. Right. So the idea is that they have too many opportunities, and they never really, you know, fail at one to get to the one that works. Right. So. But yeah, let me continue reading here from the end of the chapter. Once you understand the concept of emergent and deliberate strategy, you'll know that if you've yet to find something that really works in your career, expect to have a clear vision of where your life will take you is just wasting time. Even worse, it may actually close your mind to unexpected opportunities. While you are still figuring out your career, you should keep the aperture of your life wide open. Depending on your particular circumstances, you should be prepared to experiment with different opportunities, ready to pivot, and continue to adjust your strategy until you find what it is that both satisfies the hygiene factors and gives you all the motivators. Only then does a deliberate strategy make sense. When you get it right, you'll know. And that reminded me so much of Steve Jobs' commencement speech. Two things there. You know, one, I know in the commencement speech he said, like, all matters of the heart, you know when you see it, you know when you feel it, and you know, and if it's not right, you just got to move on, you know. And he kind of, in that commencement speech, he talks about how he just had to try a bunch of things, right? Experiment, and oh, that's not it. Oh, let me try something else. Oh, that's not it, right? And so just kind of moving on until you find those things that really light you up. But there's another part in the book from Steve Jobs speaking. I don't think it was then, but where he talks about, you know, if you wake up if you wake up and look at yourself in the mirror too many days in a row and you don't like what you're about to do, it's time to make a change, right? And so of course there are going to be those days where you're not that happy, and you have to do a bunch of kind of bullshit tasks, um, but if that's every day, that's kind of a problem, right? All right, let me continue reading. As difficult as it may seem, you've got to be honest with yourself about this whole process. Change can often be difficult, and it'll probably seem easier to just stick with what you're already doing. That thinking can be dangerous. You're only kicking the can down the road, and you risk waking up one day, years later, looking into the mirror, asking yourself, what am I doing with my life? I also want to jump to chapter 5 here, where, and this was another book that I bought that he referenced. And like so many books, like they end up being a jumping off point to other books. But this one in chapter 5, he references the origin and evolution of new businesses. And this was kind of what I was talking about before, where, so in that book, they basically say 93% of businesses have to change their initial strategy, because it turns out the initial plan is not viable. And so, yeah, this is also related to the getting to plan B, which he didn't quote that book. It's just a book I've been thinking about. This also, he contrasts the Honda Super Cub bike with Iridium, the cell phone provider, that went bankrupt after just 1 year. Because and he basically says that these companies that get a ton of money from the start, they basically have to find a viable strategy. Like every company basically has to find a viable strategy, like ASAP. And if you sequence these things wrong, then they're not going to work. And so you contrast the Iridium story, where they had a ton of money, but they didn't actually deal with a lot of those basic assumptions that caused them to fail. So like one of the assumptions was that, would people carry it in a briefcase because it was too big and heavy to fit in a pocket or a pocketbook? Stuff like that, where it's a very simple assumption. And he actually contrasts that with the Honda case study that I was talking about, where they were actually super capital constrained, because their bikes weren't selling well. And so they were like losing capital. And so it kind of forced them, kind of like inside the box again, right? This constraint thinking. But yeah, and so they were forced to find a solution. And he basically talks about how companies early on need to focus on profitability, like on cash flow, and then later trade essentially profitability for growth. But if they reverse it and do it in the wrong order, then things don't work out. So yeah, but he contrasts that, like, or compares that to children and your relationship with children, and how there's basically amazing sequencing risks with children, where actually like the first 5 years are the most important, right? There's a great documentary called the 7 Up series, which it basically films people every 7 years. I love this documentary. But so the first documentary is when they're 7, the next one they're 14, 21, and so on. And it's still going on, and it's like they're in their 60s or whatever now. So it's really interesting to watch. But the tagline of that show was, if you show me a kid when they're 7, I'll show you the way, what they're like when they're 70. And so it really is true that some of the early stuff just really matters for kids, but also for companies, right? Jump ahead to chapter 7, where he has a case study about Dell. So Dell was, naturally outsourced all they didn't make any of the computers, and they just assembled things. But then they realized that they didn't even have to assemble; they could outsource the assembly, and they were getting all their computers like pre-assembled from Asus. And so Asus basically, it's like every time you outsource, you kind of make more profit, right? Because you strip away everything you're not perfect at. But anyway, Asus ended up eating their lunch, because Dell had outsourced absolutely everything to Asus. They didn't make the chips. They didn't assemble the hardware. They didn't do anything. They just had a website, right? And so Asus ended up totally dominating Dell. But yeah, as he makes the analogy that parents today, he basically says, companies are really three things. they're a set of capabilities, and those capabilities are resources, processes, and priorities. And it's like today the parents are providing like a ton of resources, right? So they have them in the music class, the soccer class, whatever, right? But they're not actually helping develop the processes. And so, you know, instead of like just giving them all these resources, it's like, have I helped them develop the process by which they can solve any of the challenges in their life, right? So, has my child developed the skill to develop better skills? So it's almost like this meta layer here. Um, and then, he says this whole thing where, if you fully outsource the development of your child, are they even your child? Something to ponder. Related to this idea of child rearing is this book, and it's where the term "the right stuff" comes from. It's this book called High Flyers, and it's all about U.S. military pilots and how there was this idea that some pilots have the right stuff, and you could put them in pressure situations. But it turns out that really the pilots who do well, it's not that they just genetically have the right stuff, although probably some of them do, have tendencies, but it's actually that they've been in challenging situations before that give them the capabilities to like increase right, increase their ability. And so he talks about participation trophies and how parents end up giving participation trophies, but it's actually very selfish, and it's really because the parents would feel bad when their kids don't do well, and so it's really an ego thing for the parents themselves to not put their kids through pain. But of course, the kids actually want to develop these capabilities, right? And that's why kids play and do stuff like that, right? It's they're learning capabilities when it's cheap to do so, not when it's expensive down the line. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into the final chapters here. There's a lot of good ideas, though, and a lot of good analogies by how companies run and how people run and how we often trade off kind of short term gains for long term results. And like an example that he gives is like often people will work harder at their career because they see an immediate payoff where it's not really obvious what the payoff is with their spending an extra hour with the kids. But often those things are it's when things are okay, that's when you need to invest the time, because if you do it later, it's kind of too late, right? So just a lot of wisdom in this book. um, yeah, and like so many books, it just leads to like you finish this book and you have three new books to read. So read about these three books are right next to me. But yeah, and I'll link to them and this one in the bio. But yeah, great book. Thought it had a ton of wisdom. Yeah. So this is episode 9. Um, I promised myself that I'd only build a website episode 10. It's probably going to be at tailoredmadethoughts.com. I guess I should register the domain before I tell someone that. But yeah, and I'm looking to start entrepreneur community. This would be for people just starting out in business. They're actually taking action, but they're under 1 million in revenue. If that's something interesting to you, put a pin in that. I'm probably going to do something around that. We already have a small group forming, but I'll probably have something on the website about that. All right, take care.